Given that we were running a little bit over on the main session this morning, but for those who are here on time, thank you and welcome to the first of many exciting sessions. I'm Kate Brooks. I'm a member of the International Scientific Board, and I'd like to welcome you to NAM, which is the Wurundjeri name for Melbourne, and fortunately we've got some nice temperate weather for you this week versus last. And I'd also like to acknowledge the heritage and honour that heritage of the Wurundjeri people whose lands we meet on today. As a sociologist, I was extremely pleased to put my hand up to chair this session because connecting people with best practice science and just connecting in general so that we can advance how we do things is one of the things that I'm passionate about. And as a sociologist over the years, people have said, what on earth are you doing working in fisheries? And I said, actually, you know what? We don't manage fish. We manage people who fish. And the more that we can actually focus on people, the better we'll be at looking after fish. So, you know, I'm blatantly, I annoy people with that all the time, but it's really, at the end of the day, after 23 years of working in the fishing industry, doing research, and more recently as Director of the Fisheries Research and Development Board and Ozfish Unlimited, who we have a stand out there today, or for the whole conference, please go and have a chat. So it was very interesting listening to Steve's presentation on Trout Unlimited, which I know that Craig took a lot away from when he was setting up Ozfish Unlimited. So there's a lot of synergies there, so it was really great. And building on the back of both Steve and mental blank, Sasha, thank you very much. Just talking to Sasha and saying my excuse is anaesthetic brain at the moment. This morning is going to be a really great series of presentations to build on that connection and how we harness stewardship, leadership and advocacy, because they're the things that we desperately need to bring those people from schools, from communities into new ways of doing things. So many thanks again to all of you for coming. Each speaker will talk 15 minutes and I'll ask you to hold your questions and we'll have a panel session, as you can see at the end. So, without any further ado, I'd like to invite Adam Ayers up, who's a senior social scientist, Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research, and as the first of our speakers. I'll just use that tool.
Forward? Okay. Thank you. It's actually Ayers, but that's fine. So my name is Adam Ayers, and I'm a social scientist with the Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research, CIMAR, and so I technically work through the University of Hawaii at NOAA's Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center as a grantee there. So just going to go through all the speakers and then... Okay, got it. Down. Anyone?
Which way do we go? Well, it was just...
And then what is it? Just click on the name?
It should be. You just said advance it. Oh.
Yeah.
We were just saying how techie this particular conference was. It looks like it's obviously too techie. The old story of as soon as you... Mind you, the best one I ever had was turned up and lost my suitcase and the presentation was in the suitcase. And Yeah, exactly. Do you want to try and wing it? Or you can't?
I mean, I can, but I don't know. Is this because it doesn't look like anyone else's presentations are up here either. Back?
Yeah, we tried clicking on the name.
Just mic it up.
We promise we won't ask any hard questions.
So basically, I guess I'm going to wing it a little bit here. Sorry, go ahead.
That's because presentation's been closed. There you go. So now you should be able to capture it.
Now I can go right. And then what? Where's the presentation?
So for the presentation, just click on their name.
Okay.
So if you want to add them, just
Yep.
click on his name and it'll open his presentation.
Got it. There we go. Okay. Success.
Sorry.
Okay. So my talk is basically about boat-based, non-commercial fisheries and characterizing those fisheries in Hawaii to improve engagement. We use the term non-commercial because there's a variety of different ways that or motivations that people have for fishing other than just sport or pleasure. And here are my co-authors and there at NOAA. So as I mentioned, people fish for a variety of different reasons. Whether it's subsistence, whether it's for fun, whether it's for cultural reasons. So this is a term that I'm not sure that it was coined in the Pacific Islands region, but it's something I think is advanced to the NOAA's National Recreational Fisheries Policy, or is in a recent draft. That, as a term that will be used in conjunction with recreational fishing. So there's a lot of challenges to characterize and engage with these folks in Hawaii. For one, there's no recreational fishing license program or non-commercial saltwater fishing license registry or permit. There is a recent effort to have non-residents, basically folks that go fish in for hire or charter boats. Those folks have to have a license, but there's very little data other than like kind of angler intercept surveys and things to understand who is going fishing, what they're catching. So there's although that we have some statisticians that do a really good job, there's not like a true sampling frame from which to understand who these populations are. So in terms of the data that we do have, there's a fishing effort survey, which is a household survey. There's this a national program, MRIP, which there may be some folks here that are involved with that does a good job in terms of understanding people that are fishing from the shore or from boats. There's a vessel registry, and there's also some different surveys that are done every few years. One being this National Coral Reef Monitoring socioeconomic component. I think they did it in 2014 and again in 2020. And then there's some what I would say is like a la carte surveys, like this attitudes and preferences survey. So our goal was to try to use these data that we have on hand that are available to better characterize non-commercial fisheries, fishers and fishing communities in the state of Hawaii. And we're doing that in order to hopefully understand more effective engagement strategies, to improve communication, outreach, data collection, and hopefully get more people involved in the federal fisheries management process, in science and management. So to do this, we used a mixed method approach. We analyzed these different surveys, which date back almost 10 years on the left-hand side here. So that was to better characterize the folks that are going fishing. And then we also looked at an engagement component. We talked with some recreational fishing experts from across the U.S. to try to understand what was working. in different regions, NOAA regions. We conducted semi-structured interviews with those folks. We also did some unstructured interviews with some folks that were based in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands to try to understand, these are folks that used to be in the job and maybe had changed hats and things to try to understand what was working. And we also conducted a social media analysis of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Folks that are, influencers or who is, basically may know something about engagement with this group. So we have there's 5 different surveys. It's an incredible amount of data, and it's kind of challenging to present some of this data in a short presentation, but some interesting findings. We know we have data from the HMRFs or MRIP data that can tell us, which zip codes target different species most frequently, that report, fewer or more commercial sales. About 26% of households in Hawaii are fishing households, but just about 6.8% are boat-based fishing households. In terms of the non-commercial attitudes and preferences, a lot of these folks that were surveyed were men. So that's a persistent challenge, is trying to identify female fishers and female anglers as well. In terms of the people that fish from boats, these results are from 2013. We have some updates coming from 2022, which I don't have the results from that yet. But there is a lot of the kind of graying of the fleet concerns. A lot of the folks that are fishing are in the 50s or in their 60s. And these folks, in terms of their motivations, primarily motivated by recreation, by subsistence. Most popular gears were offshore trolling, shallow bottom fish, and reef trolling. And in terms of the findings from the NCRIMP survey, most of the non-commercial fishers reported fishing just once a month or less, and never giving away their catch, which is kind of stands in contrast to a lot of the findings, from kind of social studies in the region. But again, these folks are motivated by recreation, by subsistence, and then also some cost recovery or expense fishing. Average household income was probably about average or slightly above average. So in terms of the engagement, a lot of the regional goals, in terms of reviewing some of the plans across the U.S., I think that they're kind of based upon the national policy, so that the regional goals were very similar. One difference, I believe, in Hawaii is just the use of non-commercial rather than recreational. In terms of the semi-structured interviews with folks from across, NOAA folks from across the U.S., they highlighted the importance of building relationships, of being flexible, meeting people where they are, and the difficulty of engaging with the quote-unquote average fisher. In terms of the unstructured interviews with folks in Hawaii, the challenge was identifying folks, connecting with them, the timing of meetings, people who fish part-time, they have families, they have jobs. It's difficult for folks that, to come to a meeting that's at 6 or 8 p.m. So that was something that was highlighted. Another was that engagement is often one-sided. It's the science being told to them and perhaps not listening enough from the people who fish. So there's certainly some improvements that can be made in science communication. In terms of the possibilities, folks told us the importance of meeting people where they are, kind of working through community protocols and community channels, explaining the benefits of being involved in the fisheries management process, cooperative research projects. There's been a lot of tagging projects and the barbless circle hook project, which has been really successful in the region to get more people involved. In building long-term relationships with the fishing communities. In terms of the social media, Twitter wasn't a really big thing, for engagement. This is something that's mainly, scientists use to kind of put their findings out. But Facebook groups were things that a lot of people use to get information about management and things like that. Instagram was a lot of maybe bragging about catches and whatnot, but it was a pretty popular platform for non-commercial fishing. Folks would say, "Oh, I know when the ahi are running," because you start seeing the pictures on social media. And then the YouTube was a lot of kind of influencers, and a lot of this stuff is driven to kind of sell gear. So what does this mean for characterization? The social data that are available do provide, it's not hidden, but there's ways that we can kind of cut up the data in different ways to provide better information that could inform engagement at like kind of lower levels, like at a zip code level. And these kind of disparate data collections, like the non-commercial attitudes and preferences survey, the NCREMP survey, which is a household survey, a random sample household survey, but it's something that is done irregularly. So if we had some kind of a socioeconomic monitoring program like we did, for the white ships and things, I think that we'd have a better handle on the social aspects of this important population. So in terms of engagement, the in-person meetings are really important. COVID has made that pretty difficult. We need to find new ways to share information outside of journal articles. I think we heard that in the keynote this morning. Cooperative research seems to help with the scientific literacy. Social media has some potential to build partnerships and with some influencers and fishing stores and things. And there's also some potential to develop some use the social data to develop representative fishing panels. It's used in a lot of different fields, and I don't know why we couldn't use it to gain better input. And lastly, just building kind of commitment to build long-term relationships with the fishing communities. It takes a long time to build trust, and it can be kind of ruined pretty quickly. And just want to thank all the people that shared information with me, the engagement experts, and all their thoughtful comments. Thank you.
Hi, and I'd like to welcome Adam from New South Wales DPI. Sorry, Craig. Sorry, Craig. Well, no, I go back. There you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. Come in, everyone. Come in.
Actually, come in and perhaps shut that door behind you, if you could. There's plenty of seats down the front here.
So, my name's Craig, and my co-author Tom is he's chairing another session, so he's floating around the conference. You might get to meet Tom later, but Tom and myself work for the Freshwater Ecosystems Research Unit for New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, and I want to talk to you a bit about a project that we've been running called Fish Screens Australia. But the talk itself is really about using that project to illustrate the sort of transformational change we can get in our rivers if we have an engaged recreational fishing community that's prepared just to think outside the box and back a different idea. I want to kick off the talk with this quite startling headline figure, and that's 97 million native fish. That's the number of fish we actually estimate that we're losing from about 4,500 pump diversions across New South Wales. Small pumps, big pumps, pumps not unlike that one pictured up there, pumps for agriculture, pumps for town water supply, pumps for industry. And we know we're losing those startling numbers because we've done the research. We've put nets in channels, we've counted those losses. And we've also looked back at some of the historical literature and reports going back to the 1920s. And at the end of this talk, I'll provide a link to a website, and that has, you'll be able to find some of those papers. We published a paper on that evidence last year if you want to find out a bit more about it. And as a fisheries department, those huge losses concern us greatly. As a recreational fishing community, those losses should concern you a lot because they're undermining biodiversity, they're undermining river recovery, and they're undermining your ability to catch fish. Each year in New South Wales, we stock about 5 million native fish into our rivers, and each year we lose about 20 times that amount at water diversions. So this image here shows some Murray cod fingerlings. This was only taken about a month ago. These fish were stocked into the Macquarie River, and then we caught them within 24 hours at that diversion. We know that they were those hatchery fish because we used genetics to track them back to the broodstock back at the hatchery. So that destocking of rivers at pumps is large, but it's even larger when we look at gravity-fed diversions that are more common down here in the south. And there was a study done in the 1990s by Gilligan and Schiller, and they looked at 5 main diversions downstream of Yarrawonga. And we estimate from that data that we were losing, in a 3-month period, we were losing enough golden perch, silver perch and Murray cod to account for 82% of the total New South Wales annual stocking efforts of those 3 species in 3 months. Startling figures. And we're losing that many fish because most diversions either are unscreened or they use these old antiquated trash screens, and they're just a poor performer when it comes to fish protection and debris control. So these are the sort of things that happen. It's a headache for farmers and it's bad news for the environment. So you get fish on paddocks, you get fish caught in inline filters with other debris, or just glued against screens. And for a long time, farmers have had to deal with, if they do put intake screens on, just poor designs that just block and don't work. But it doesn't need to be that way. There is a technology out there that have been applying it internationally for close to a century, and that's in modern fish protection screens. And you can get modern fish protection screens to fit any size diversion, any pump, any gravity fed of any size. They can be cylinders, they could be cones, they can be horizontal flat panels, vertical panels, travelling belts. They can be self-cleaning with brushes, airburst systems and water jets. How do they work? Well, they simply really just change the hydraulics in front of the intake. So at the sort of unscreened or traditional screened intake, the mesh is too coarse and the velocity is too high. It can be as high as about 3 metres a second at the intake. So fish can't swim against it. They get sucked in along with other debris into the intake, or they get held against the mesh. How a modern screen differs is it's got a much finer mesh, could be 2-3 mil, can get down as low as 50 micron, but it's got a much larger surface area, and that flow of water is spread across the entire surface area. So at any point on that screen, there's very little suction. So the velocity drops from 3 metres a second down to 0.1 metres a second. So fish can swim right up against it and not get sucked against it. And importantly, the farmer can get clean water, the fish stay in the river, and the extraction can occur at the same volume and the same rate, so it doesn't affect water delivery. And this is what it looks like in action. You can see there a Murray cod, fingerling, quite happy to bop along the surface of that screen because that velocity is really low. You genuinely cannot even feel that there's a suction if you put your hand on it. And you can see there that screen wiping away, working in quite, that's a shot from America on the right, a cone screen working in quite dirty water. And we've done the research to show that if we get these designs right, we can save 90% of fish at the intakes. And we've done 10 years worth of research. We've got the best technology from overseas. We've tailored them for Australian fish and Australian farms by doing work in the laboratory and both in the field. And we've produced design guidelines and specifications so that manufacturers and water users can apply screens that work fit for purpose for Australian conditions. And we've got manufacturers now producing these locally for Australian farms and exporting them. Award-winning screens here in Australia. And we're rolling these screens out now at scale. In New South Wales, for instance, on the Macquarie River, we've got a $13.5 million project where we're aiming to screen in excess of 70% of the extracted regulated flow down that system at a number of projects. Or if you look further north up to the Barwon-Darling and Gwydir, you've got the Commonwealth investing $20 million in priority projects to screen diversions up there. And this investment, these screens are going to mean more fish in the river, more fish that can contribute to future populations. Once they reach breeding age, these benefits are going to compound as those fish breed. And we estimate that by the time we realise the Northern Basin Toolkit and Macquarie screening projects, we're going to be up at saving 2 million native fish per year. And if we get extra funding to look at the pipeline projects that we've already got set up with eager water users, we can get that up to 3 million by 2025. It's important to recognise though that screening in Australia didn't really start when the Kahuna screen went in down here in Victoria. Before 2012, I think 2007, 2010, I did a couple of trips over to the United States to try to figure out how their programs work. They've been screening for a century over there, how they work, what works, what didn't. And on the back of that, a colleague and myself, Lee Baumgartner, wrote a paper advocating for a screening program in Australia and outlining a plan of how we might be able to achieve that. So why then did it take 6 years before we got that first project in? Well, I think it would be fair to say I really underestimated the lack of acknowledgement that there was actually a problem out there, but there was also a massive lack of awareness that there was a solution. So how did we then get from a period where we had this inertia and inability to move forward to now where we're seeing exponential growth in installations? And if I personally think about it, I think there was a real pivotal moment back in 2017 when the New South Wales Recreational Fishing Trust funded a group of engaged anglers to go over to the Pacific Northwest and to meet with grassroots organisations like Trout Unlimited to see how they've been working with industry, government and farmers to deliver restoration projects. And we're privileged to hear about some of those projects and the organisation this morning. But there you can see fisherman Matt Hanson, many of you probably know, looking every bit the Aussie ambassador in his VB shirt over there, meeting, talking fish screens with fellas from the Farmers Conservation Alliance and Oregon Fish and Wildlife. And that trip really lit a fire in the belly of people like Matt and people like Craig Copeland, who founded Fish Unlimited. Those guys have become champions for screening here in Australia, and they've mobilised more recreational anglers to become champions, to stand shoulder to shoulder with scientists, with managers, with local members of Parliament, with ministers for fish and ag, to really advocate and agitate for a new best practice in water diversion in Australia. And a big part or thing that followed on from that was the establishment of Fish Screens Australia. So it's funded by the New South Wales Fishing Trust, led by DPI Fisheries, but in partnership with Charles Sturt University and Ozfish, and has received funding through the Potter Foundation. As well as facilitating some of the research I mentioned earlier, Fish Screens Australia has been really pivotal in bringing people together. And it's brought together scientists, managers, engineers, fishers, farmers, experts in screening, both locally and internationally, brought them together to develop audience-specific communication and extension material, to co-design investment plans and funding proposals to really drive implementation. And one reason for the success of Fish Screens Australia is we've been getting screens that work into the hands of farmers that need them. These industry leaders, these early adopters, these champions. And again, the New South Wales Recreational Fishing Trust was instrumental in helping that happen, because they funded some social science that we did, looking at the motivations and abilities of industry to adopt. What are some of their drivers? What are some of their barriers to modernising? Essentially, sitting down with industry and with farmers and trying to understand what they need from a modern fish protection screen. And we've used that information and those industry leaders to help us sell screens to other farmers. No one sells a screen like a farmer with a screen. Like Ian and Marina Ricks down there on the Lower Darling, they're almond farmers. They've got a water clean screen, 50 microns. That's protecting fish, but it's also saving them a heap of water. They don't have to backflush a $30,000 inline filter anymore. Well, Shane Smith, part of Trangie Never Tie irrigation scheme up on the Macquarie, not only is he saving Murray cod and catfish, but he's also saving about $50,000 a year on reduced power costs through more efficient water delivery. So if I look at Fish Screens Australia, now in its fourth and final year, we've achieved a lot. There's so much more to do. I think when we first started, there was a healthy degree of scepticism of why should rec anglers be investing in ag tech? And I think the proof's in the pudding when you can really see the uptake that it's been able to drive since then. I think has been rather phenomenal. There's a lot more to do, a mountain to climb, but I think we should celebrate the successes. And I think I look at it and I think the New South Wales Rec Fishing Trust have invested about $700,000 so far in screening advocacy and uptake, and we've used that to leverage $39 million worth of investment. That's a startling 560% return on investment from recreational fishing money. That's going to put 2 million more native fish in the river by 2024, with the prospect of that getting up as high as 3 million by 25-26. That's millions more fish in the river every year where they can breed and contribute to future populations. It could really be a game changer for Australian rivers. A future of better farming, better fishing, more vibrant regional communities. And it's all because there were some passionate recreational anglers who cared enough to try and make a difference, to agitate for change. And because organisations like the New South Wales Recreational Fishing Trust dared to think outside the box, fund something that was a little left field and different, and really awaken what is looking to be the sleeping giant of river restoration. So if you want to find out more about the program, Fish Screens Australia, about fish screening in general, or about any of the science that I talked about, some of the showcases, then you can go to fishscreens.org.au. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Craig. And I'd like to welcome Danny.
Yes, all right.
Oh, I'm really doing well this morning.
How do I find this? Where do I go?
Okay.
Can you get people to come
Can
up
people just come on in?
and fill the
sit
chairs
down?
up? Yep.
Okay.
So now Sweet.
Thanks, Andy.
Yep.
All the way from Massachusetts. Please keep coming in. There's a whole lot of seats down the front here. Don't be shy. Keep on coming in. Keep on coming in. Can we move it along? We're just a little bit behind time, so I want you guys in here and able to listen. Thanks so much for that, Ken.
Good. Is that right?
So apologies on my name confusion this morning. Totally useless. So Andy will be following on. Leveraging angler passions to advance conservation. Keep coming down the front, and if you can do that quietly, then I'll ask you to close the door to avoid any outdoor noise.
Kate, thanks very much. I appreciate being here. I'm stoked about the World Rec Fish Conference. Been delighted to be in Australia for the last 3 weeks. Enjoy the hospitality. It's just been awesome. And so I want to start, so my talk's about beyond engagement, but I want to start with a little survey. How many people in here actually fish recreationally? All right, cool. How many people have more than 3 fishing rods in their basement or their garage? Yeah, me too. How many people think they spend maybe like a good portion of their annual salary on fishing? Yeah, okay. So like anglers are nuts, they're crazy, they're super passionate about what they do. We know that participation rates are high globally. We know that recreational angling was the sport of the pandemic, right? We saw that in the US, participation rates were through the roof. Manufacturers had supply chain issues. You know, it has huge economic benefits to local, regional, and global community. Anglers are nuts, they're super passionate, and I think there's an opportunity to leverage that passion, right? And it requires also there to be healthy fish in the waters to fuel that passion. And so, let's see if I can actually use the technology correctly. So I grew up in Canada. I live in the US, but I grew up in Canada. And I was finishing my PhD around the time that this paper came out by John Post and others, called Canada's Recreational Fisheries, The Invisible Collapse, with a question mark. And it brought awareness to the fact that, you know, we were focusing a lot on commercial fisheries, we were tracking commercial fisheries, and we saw that they were struggling, but this paper, it was focused on lakes in Alberta and saw that, you know, catch per unit effort was going down, participation rates were going up, and anglers were still fishing like mad and crazy. And it brought the attention that recreational fisheries are largely data deficient, they're data poor, and if we're not careful, we're gonna miss seeing those trends as the populations decline, because participation rates can continue to go up because anglers are nuts and crazy and they continue to want to fish. So this was a big eye-opener for me. It's when I started to shift my career over into doing a lot of work on recreational fisheries. I grew up fishing, my family fishes, this is the way it is. But when we interact with anglers, we start talking about who is responsible when their success declines, or with the success of their fishing, however they define it, right? Anglers are passionate. Their success could be catching lots of fish. It could be catching big fish. It could be going out on the river and just enjoying the experience. We know that conditions change, and when they start feeling those conditions change, they're the first line of defense. They know what's going on in the environment. They start to freak out, right? And what's happening to my fish? What's happening to my fishing experience, right? They take it personally, even though that they might not be responsible for the change that's happening. Traditionally, government agencies are tasked with the monitoring and managing of recreational fisheries, often in collaboration with outside agencies, research scientists. And the challenge here is that recreational, and it's different than commercial fishing, it's hugely dispersed, right? We've got anglers from high mountain streams to the pelagic waters, targeting so many different species, so many different techniques. And so we saw over the past 20 years this evolution where we're starting to get anglers involved in monitoring, right? Whether it's reporting catches, tag and recapture, habitat restoration efforts. We saw Steve Moyer talk about a lot of the things that TU's been doing, which is amazing. Water quality monitoring. We've seen the introduction and the use of citizen science, which is great as a mode for engagement. But as we've been moving through time, anglers continue to see the threats to their fish and their fisheries, and anglers want to play a larger role in the future success of their recreational fisheries, especially in the light of real or perceived threats, and whether that's environmental or failure in policy and management, right? They're super passionate, they want to take ownership over it, and they want to feel that they are a bit more engaged in the process of taking care of their recreational fisheries. And Sasha mentioned it this morning in her keynote about the angler-driven science that I'm going to talk about a bit today. I'm presenting 3 case studies that I've used in my lab with my collaborators and my partners. And really the questions that I'm presenting that coming from in these case studies, they came from the anglers, they came from the guides. Right? We're scientists, we could think of these wonderful questions about monitoring the fish and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the anglers appreciate, understand, and then apply the knowledge that the science is going to be generating, right? And so this, in my mind, is a way to really think about leveraging angler passions for knowledge co-production, And I think there's lots of talks, a few talks in the conference over the next 3 days about knowledge co-production. And there's also talk about bridging that knowledge action gap. So I'm not going to focus on those things. I'm just going to present some case studies. And if you're interested, popcorn around, move around, and see some of these other people that are a lot more experienced in the social science behind those things than I am. Along the way, when I started working with recreational anglers, I developed a personal model. And it really, oh shit, excuse me, did I say that? Shoot. And so for all of these cases, so I'm going to talk about steelhead on the Bulkley River. I'm going to talk about giant trevally in the Seychelles, and Luke Griffin is really going to expand on that in a talk this afternoon. This afternoon, thank you. And then I'm going to talk about a current project on golden dorado in South America, all driven by anglers, those questions. But really the fundamental model, I'll try not to swear again, that it was stemming from a lot of work that we were initially doing on understanding how anglers, we can get them involved in science related to catch and release and some questions that they were coming to us with. And I developed this model largely working with, actually in an experiential education setting, working with high school students, and then expanded it as we were starting to engage with recreational anglers and they were coming to us with questions. I'm not going to go through all the details in here, but I just want to focus on the words that are highlighted in gray about this process. And the process that I do, and I use this for my science, I use this for my teaching, I use this in formal university settings, I also use this for talking to angler groups. This idea of immersion, involvement, ownership, and legacy. Anglers are also already kind of immersed in their environment. They see what's going on, but if we can then take the next step, they bring questions to us and we can immerse them in the science and in the environment and get them directly involved. And this is like a little bit beyond citizen science because the questions are generated by them. So they've already started to take a little bit more of an investment in that. And then by the time they get through the research process and working with us and understanding how science operates, they're building trust in the process, they build trust in the science, and they start to take ownership over the outcome, ownership over the data that they've helped generate. And at the end of the day, they feel that how that's going to go back into the legacy to help maintain their success as recreational anglers, the health of the recreational fisheries, the health of the environment. And then, I see this as a feedback loop. And the more that we can do this, I think the greater we get in terms of the engagement with anglers and how this is going to benefit both, grassroots movements and government agencies in making sure that there's the application of science. So I'm going to, 5 minutes? Whoo, shit. Okay, so we're again. Really quickly. The Bulkley River study, Steelhead, Skeena River watershed, one of the premier steelhead rivers. The population has been struggling, it's been declining, and anglers came to us and said, it's all catch and release. What's our role in the decline of steelhead? So they asked whether the impacts, what are the impacts, are they a major threat? I'm not going to present the science, but what I'm going to present in this case study is that it took a lot of big partnership building. We could have used, and I was approached by one funder that said, we can fund all of this. And I said, no, because we want it, because of the competition of a lot of NGOs, because of some tension between government agencies and First Nations. I wanted to create a setting where everybody had a place at the table. Nobody felt that they had a higher sense of ownership over the other group. And at the end of the day, they were all involved in some really cool physiology, really cool radiotelemetry is going on. And we created obviously some really good science, both science and social science. We brought some social scientists in along to do some work side by side. And it was a really cool, there's some really neat outcomes. And you can look at the science later, it's really boring. The next case study is thinking about carrying capacity. So we were approached by a lodge that has a high-end set of fishing clients, and they were worried about the amount of angler traffic that they were putting on the flats and how it was changing the behavior primarily of this beast, giant trevally. They were already doing some logbook collections. They had a lot of data. They didn't know how to really analyze it. Luke's going to talk a little bit about that. But they asked, can our code of conduct in terms of best practices for catch and release be improved? And how can we make the recreational fishery more sustainable? So it's a really cool place to do research, by the way. And what was really needed here was some capacity for doing science and also analyzing the data. So there was the lodge, and there was also a government agency, and we brought in some NGOs, and we were working collaboratively to actually implement the science, to do some skill-based training in terms of acoustic telemetry, including some work with accelerometer loggers. And Luke's going to talk a lot more about this. 2 minutes? Okay, I'll get it. And so it's really thinking about capacity building through bringing science to the table. And they're continuing to do more work. The last one I talk about is Golden Dorado. This is ongoing, that understanding the impacts about fragmentation. In South America, neotropical rivers are being carved up by dams and water diversions, much like things are happening in Australia. And there was little no scientific information on the movements of this iconic species, which is showing up on a lot of magazine covers. And they really wanted to know, the anglers wanted to know, because they wanted to leverage government agencies, what's the management unit? At what scale should these fish be managed? And so we ended up working with, we got some funding from the IGFA. We started to work with the Vertebrate Genome Lab. We're mapping the genome for Golden Dorado. It's almost done. And we brought in some, basically built a network between anglers and scientists domestically in South America. This happened during COVID. If we didn't have this network, this project would have just collapsed. And it was hugely successful, or it is successful so far. Tips for moving beyond engagement. I have 1 minute, right? Okay, good.
30 seconds.
30 seconds? Okay, I'm going really fast. I should have had more caffeine. So thinking about developing or using or embracing, using your own model for engagement. This is where we need to move past it. I often hear the words citizen science or engagement, and then you look at what's behind the scenes, and there's often not a lot of context for how you're using words, how you're building relationships. And so, things that I've learned along the way with all these projects and stuff I'm going to continue to embrace is, listen, observe, and learn, respect existing relationships, encourage inclusivity in terms of the existing partners that are in place, propose rather than impose. Scientists often get on an ivory tower, and we have to think about how we are careful in terms of communicating our ideas. Ask for and have patience. In North America, we're really, 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 really impatient. Being transparent and honest, manage expectations. We can talk more about this later. I don't want to take up much time. Last slide. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Don't worry.
Thanks, Andy. Very much appreciated. Sorry to be winding you up. And now we're going to welcome Russell to come and talk to. Russell's the Senior Policy Advisor with NOAA. And I'm just trying to find... You can do your own introduction to your... Let's go... Do you want to grab that one? And go backwards?
Backwards.
Okay. Now
Forwards.
try up. Okay.
There we go.
There we go. And we go on that. There you are.
All right, thanks. My name's Russ Dunn, and I work for the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We were going to hire Andy, but he swears too much, so we dropped that. My role is I lead our Recreational Fisheries initiative, and essentially the primary external goal of that initiative is to build a strong and trusting relationship with anglers. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we engage with and harness the leadership and expertise of anglers. Before I do that, however, I want to just give a little context of the size and scope of the U.S. fisheries. So, as I said, my colleagues and I work for NOAA, and it is our federal agency charged with managing or stewardship of living marine resources in the U.S. EEZ. The US EEZ is the largest in the world. It's got about 13,000 linear miles of coastline, about 3.4 million square miles, nautical square miles of ocean area, which is bigger than the US land area. And being the federal management authority, our jurisdiction is primarily limited to that EEZ, so 3 to 200 miles offshore, where our states essentially have stewardship responsibility from shore out to 3 miles. We have about 460 stocks under management in 46 different management plans across the country. And again, this is all in the US EEZ, so this is just the marine side of the US recreational fishery. We don't know the status of every stock, but we do have a good sense for quite a number of them. Of those where we have a known overfishing status, fewer than 10% are subject to overfishing. And of those where we know the overfished status, about 20% are estimated to be overfished. In terms of the sort of economic contributions of our fisheries, they're really important contributors at all levels, national, regional, and local. It's really, recreational fishing is really the lifeblood of a lot of coastal communities in the U.S. We've got about 14 million anglers who in 2020 took around 199 million trips that we estimate. I am going to challenge this morning's statement that Victoria is the fishing capital of the world. So where I live in Florida, we estimate about 88 million trips in Florida last year, or in 2020. We estimate that anglers in the U.S. in the marine environment caught about a billion fish. They keep about 1/3 of that, release about 2/3. From an economic perspective, the rec component of our fisheries is really a powerhouse. Supported around 600,000 direct jobs, drove about $98 billion in sales of goods and services, and contributed roughly $55 billion to the U.S. GDP. So I want to now sort of touch on how do we actually engage with the anglers. So the primary law governing U.S. marine fisheries management is called the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management and Conservation Act. And the core of the Magnuson Act is a management through 8 regional councils under the concept that those who live and fish in a region really know how to manage those resources best. So there are 8 regional councils you can see on their jurisdictional areas you can see on screen here. And those councils are comprised of commercial and recreational fishermen, along with academics, nonprofits, and various state and federal officials. And the role of those councils is to develop fisheries management plans. And they develop and vote on those plans with substantial public input. Then, once those plans are adopted, the regulatory process begins, and those are mandated to have additional public comment and input opportunities during development. So each stage of the regulatory process, from developing the fishery management plans to developing the actual implementing regulations, really afford legitimate and substantial input from the recreational community, as well as all other sectors of the fishery. And this is just one aspect. This is the sort of formal regulatory input process. And the reality is that we really work to engage fishermen in numerous ways in essentially every aspect of our work, from management and regulation, which I just touched on, to science and hands-on conservation work, to policy development and implementation. So outside of the regulatory process, we really employ a broad suite of engagement tools and opportunities at the federal level to utilize the expertise and gain the expertise of anglers from around the country. You can see up here just some of those mechanisms: cooperative research, where we're partnering with the angling community to collect science and data; citizen science, where the anglers really lead that work; conservation and restoration, we provide a fair amount of money to the recreational community to actually get in the water and restore habitats and other things. Federal advisory committees, so those are separate from the management councils I just talked about. There are a number of different federal advisory committees who then provide their direct inputs to our would be here, ministers, so our Secretary of Commerce, our Secretary of Interior, etc. We host routine, regional, and national dialogues across the country, and and we engage them deeply in policy development. And I'll touch on one of these in just a minute. And you can hear more about some of this non-regulatory activity in this room tomorrow at 2:50 when Tim Sartwell speaks. So one example of engaging in a national dialogue is this. It's the National Saltwater Recreational Fisheries Summit. We hold this every 4 years, and the most recent one was last March 2022, and where we partnered with a regional management body called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to host about 175 leaders of the recreational fisheries from around the country, along with scientists and managers. We had about another 90 online. Topics we touched on, as you can see up here, we touched on climate, we touched on various ocean uses which may become conflicts, and really during the summit what we really focused on was emerging wind energy development, which is just exploding in the U.S., as well as aquaculture. We talked about data collection and use. There's always concern about data and a lot of misunderstanding about it. And then management mechanisms themselves. And the summit was really truly guided by anglers. And so what do I mean by that? Well, the anglers were involved at every stage of the process in both planning and execution. So we began a year before by meeting with anglers from all around the country to solicit their inputs on what do you want to talk about when we get together in 2022. And we did this all around the country. We then formed, so that was 2021. So we then formed a steering committee in the late summer of 2021 that was primarily comprised of anglers. So 11 of the 14 members of the steering committee were from the angling community. And then we met about 10 times with them and shared all we had learned during those late winter and early spring meetings. So the steering committee sat down and considered everything we had heard at those early meetings. They brought their own priorities to the table. And then the steering committee developed the discussion topics that you saw, the agenda itself, and identified the majority of key participants in the meeting. So they really drove the meeting agenda. So here this is the summit process itself, and obviously it starts in the upper left and works, following the arrows there. Let's see. So each topic at the summit itself was introduced by a mixed panel of anglers, government experts, and private sector experts. So private sector meaning, for example, when we were discussing wind and aquaculture, we had folks from those industries come talking to the meeting. We then engaged in a large group discussion with obviously all the anglers in the room. And then we broke into community breakouts where the anglers themselves actually facilitated the discussions, understanding that anglers are often more comfortable speaking to anglers rather than the government guys. And then we took all the outputs from all of the discussions there, summarized them, drafted a final report, provided that back to the steering committee that again was comprised primarily of anglers for their editing and approval. So what did we hear just briefly? We heard that climate-driven impacts are visible on the water and are happening rapidly. We heard their concerns that science and management processes are not keeping up with the pace of change that they're seeing on the water, that there are already being able to identify climate winners and losers, meaning, so for example, where fish are moving up the coast following the cool water, with a range shift, we're seeing some fisheries gaining species, and others are seeing impacts such as increased problems with water quality, etc. And the anglers' big concern was impacts on the resource and loss of access. For wind energy and aquaculture, they were keen to be engaged early in the planning process. They're concerned that the impacts of the infrastructure going in the water are not well understood, that we're missing the data that are needed to really understand those impacts. They, again, were concerned of loss of access to, for example, traditional fishing grounds or changes in the fishery, say, if migratory patterns may change because of the infrastructure. And then interestingly, there is a large portion of anglers who are interested in, once the structures are decommissioned, keeping those in the water as fishable structure. In terms of the data discussion and management discussion, what we heard really for data is that uncertainty in the data is undermining trust among anglers, meaning in some instances there's large confidence intervals around the data. Climate change is exacerbating that uncertainty, making things more difficult. Data are being used beyond their capacity, and what does this mean? It means that our primary data collection system for recreational catch and effort was really designed to produce annual efforts at a regional level, and it's often asked to provide estimates at much finer granularity. There's a perception that the agency is not responsive to the concerns or interests of anglers when it comes to data, and they want more and better data faster. With management, they want us to better account for us, meaning the councils and NOAA, to better account for socioeconomic factors in decision-making. That really goes primarily in the U.S. to allocation battles between commercial and recreational interests. There's increased in having us be more nimble in the management, more flexible in the management, but they want us to balance speed and flexibility with stability. So I'm not going to touch on all the follow-through that, excuse me, that we are working on here, but I do want to touch on the final one here, updating the policy. So we drafted a policy in 2015. It was published, the original. We realized during the meeting that it needed to be updated, that there are things missing, like, for example, it doesn't even mention climate. So we walked away realizing it's time to update that, and in this room at 10:45 tomorrow, Sean Morton is going to speak to our efforts to do that are underway right now. So, in sum, anglers want to be part of the process, and their participation is really essential for successful stewardship. Proactive engagement is critical. We cannot wait for anglers to become concerned and ultimately raise an issue. We have to go out and proactively engage anglers to learn what's on their mind before it becomes a crisis, and that in doing so, a real range of mechanisms is necessary. Different people are comfortable in different settings, and you can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to trying to harness inputs. So to close, saltwater anglers in the U.S. are really engaged and contribute to the science and stewardship process through a suite of both regulatory and non-regulatory mechanisms. Done.
Thank you very
And
much,
no
Russ.
swearing.
And you actually finished 30 seconds short, so I'm impressed. Thank you very much to Russ. And take this opportunity to welcome our last speaker, Matthew Farthing, who's here with us from South Africa, to talk about a strategic conservation planning initiative identifies recreational fisheries as the primary intervention point to conserve threatened cob species.
Thank you. I think so.
So find your,
Yeah.
and then click on this.
Right.
No? Okay.
This one, yeah.
Go back to...
Resume slideshow.
How do we get to that screen? We're clicking on the slide, but it's not actually coming up. This highly technical system.
Sorry,
so
man.
technical, no one except the experts.
Okay.
can pass it.
Feel free to make it abundantly clear the mistake I made to everybody.
To every, down the bottom. Do you want to just actually start the... This makes us feel better when the experts are having problems. And our gained 30 seconds is rapidly lost.
Yeah, I'll put it onto presentation. What's the others? They've gone onto the wrong.
This is the presentation we want.
Yep.
How do we get it?
So we're in presentation mode.
Yep. It's on the. I think it's on the wrong.
Because it's
That's the only other thing it could be.
Bad.
I can show you all on my phone.
Oh, okay. Can we leave? There we go.
Thank you very much. Ta. Awesome. Good morning, everybody. My name is Matthew Farthing. I'm a postdoc from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, and I've been working with a group of universities and the South African National Biodiversity Institute on developing a conservation strategy for cob in South Africa, and I'm excited to share with you today what it is we have planned for an intervention focused specifically on the recreational fishery. So your first question probably is, what on earth is a cob? Well, in this part of the world, you call them Malawai, but it's generally a collective term for the 4 species in South Africa that we have in the genus Argyrosomus. So as, where's the pointer? So here's the one that you are likely to recognize, which is what we call the dusky cob. And then we have the silver cob, Argyrosomus inodorus, the square-tailed cob, Argyrosomus thorpii. And as of the last 25 years, we've had a climate change-driven southward migration of the west coast dusky cob from the core of its range in Angola down into South African waters. So what we have now is a group of 4 species that look almost identical. Don't let the artistic renderings fool you. The average person cannot, including me, cannot tell them apart. And they occupy slightly different but generally overlapping distributions along our coastline. So what you end up with is a recipe for taxonomic confusion historically. And as a result, we can't really account for the historical abundance individually. But what we can say with certainty is that the group was historically very abundant. And as demonstrated in these 2 studies, there's been a significant decline in the Argyrosomus group along the South African coastline in the 20th century, which is not a unique story. And typically, globally, we see this kind of trend with cyanids, and that's because, particularly those in the Argyrosomus genus, they are inherently susceptible. And this is because they're generally large, typically long-lived, somewhat late maturing and gonochoristic. But it's particularly because they're patternable and predictable, particularly when they spawn in large aggregations in very predictable areas. But it's also because many of them exhibit quite a strong reliance on freshwater flowing into the sea, which leads to a degree of direct or indirect estuarine dependency. But perhaps more than anything, it's because they're valuable and desirable, not only to sport fishers, and not only for sport fishers and for food, but also because their maw is very, very valuable. It's therefore no surprise that, at least for the 3 species for which we have sufficient information, we can tell that the stocks have collapsed and are continually in decline. Perhaps most concerningly, dusky cob, which is that most favored by recreational anglers in South Africa, has been most recently assessed to be at 1.3% of its pristine biomass. So it's this conservation need that drove a group of us to collaborate in an attempt to develop this document, which is a conservation strategy to halt the decline of cob in South Africa, in cob populations in South Africa. So what we did is we followed the IUCN Strategic Conservation Strategy Framework and conducted a pretty comprehensive status review to inform some red list assessments, and then conducted 2 workshops with, in which we collaborated with the State Management Agency, various NGOs, and all the relevant research institutions in South Africa. And granted, there's a lot of information in this document that doesn't necessarily pertain to recreational fisheries, but following a prioritization workshop, what I really want to point out to you is that the South African line fishery ranks as the single highest threat to this species, this group of species. Now in South Africa, our line fishery is complex and multi-species and comprises 3 sectors. The first is an exclusively boat-based commercial line fishery with about just under 3,000 participants operating from 455 vessels along our entire coastline. The second is a recently promulgated small-scale fishery which operates from both boat and shore, but for the most part from these small boats which we call buckies. But by and large, the relatively colossal recreational fishery dwarfs the rest of the line fishery, with a shore-based fishery with nearly 400,000 participants and a boat-based fishery with nearly 70,000 participants. So the marine recreational fishery in South Africa is large and sophisticated, and cob are among the primary targets in almost all facets. And while really, really big cob are the dream for most sports anglers, the reality is that the group is subject to significant recruitment and growth overfishing, because fishing takes place in all their habitats, from when they're far below the size, the legal size range, to when they're far above what should really be the slot limit. So as a result, a lot of the cod that are caught are below the legal size limit and are therefore subject to catch and release by anglers of varying skill levels. And while there is certainly evidence of some groups of proactive pro-environmental anglers demonstrating best practices, the reality is that the best practice is not the norm, and many user communities have pretty poor handling and pretty poor harvest ethics and pretty low compliance. So as it stands, the state fishery regulator attempts to manage the recreational fishery with a pretty complex set of sector and region-specific bag and size limit regulations. And it's done this because, granted, the average angler can't separate any of the 4 species. So when fishing offshore of the province of KZN from a boat, you're most likely to catch one of the species. And so those size and bag limit regulations do their best to appeal to that. And if you're fishing offshore west of Cape Agulhas over here, the regulations pertain to the species you're most likely to run into there. And while this represents perhaps the most sensible compromise, we've long known that the actual regulations are terribly inadequate to halt the decline for cob. And that's what prompted, and even at this stage overdue, the State Management Agency's Lionfish Scientific Working Group to recommend some significant improvements and changes to the regulations, which include a slot limit for all species, a reduced recreational bag limit for all species, a 3-month closed season in Natal to protect spawning in the KwaZulu-Natal province to protect spawning aggregations, and then thirdly, a prohibition on night fishing in all South African estuaries as the most realistic compromise to a blanket moratorium. Now, despite the fact that these were brought for recommendation in 2015, now in 2023, we are no closer to getting these through. And that's because of an issue in the way that our Recreational Fisheries Act is written. So unlike our commercial fishery, where you can change bag and size limit regulations as permit stipulations whenever you more or less choose, our recreational fisheries regulations, are written into the Act. And the only way you change this is following a massive public consultation at the national level. And as a result, there's very little political will. So consequently, the recreational cob fishery in South Africa is characterized by an open access, almost completely unmonitored fishery for a threatened, collapsed, and declining group of species, comprising anglers with a pretty low compliance rate. This study by a colleague of ours, Chris Bova, suggests that compliance with fisheries regulations in this fishery is about 50%. And this is largely because of a declining fear of penalty and a perceived illegitimacy of the management agencies, and also a dwindling state capacity for enforcement of an inadequate set of bag and size limit regulations written into a dysfunctional legal structure which is slow to amend and has an incredibly low political will to change. So, I promise it's not all doom and gloom, because you may ask the question, well, what on earth could we possibly do about that situation? And short of inciting a riot, a social movement of self-reform. So what we have in mind is to use a community-based social marketing approach to deliver a suite of alternative management strategies that don't rely on enforcement. And instead of waving the stick, better relies on fostering community support to promote a suite of pro-environmental behaviors and otherwise unenforceable catch-release practices to promote stewardship of cob and promote self-regulation of the fishery. Because when you can't rely on the state, we've got to rely on the anglers themselves. So, how do we plan on doing that? I need to get working and get the laser here. So, like I said before, we're hoping to use the community-based social marketing approach to develop, to initiate a suite of alternative management strategies. Our first idea is to tackle compliance in the fishery with a social norms approach. Chris Bova, the same guy who had the 50% compliance estimate, did a study where he assessed that the that a social norms approach was probably a very adequate way to go about improving compliance in the South African recreational fishery. The second step, we think, is to tackle the otherwise unenforceable catch and release best practice behaviours, following the model that Warren Potts has adopted by working with competitive anglers in the country. Thank you. So Warren's done incredible work to work with anglers in competitive bodies to make real changes in the kind of catch and release behaviours you couldn't otherwise regulate. The third is to use, is to follow the recommendations of this paper by Andy Danylchuk and co. To engage the tackle industry as much as possible. We know full well now that the tackle industry plays a big role in leading thought in the recreational fishery, and I think that aligning our messaging with what the tackle industry does and getting them to align their messaging as best as they can with ours will make a real difference. And not just the manufacturers, but also small retailers. In a fishery like South Africa, where the recreational fishery is not always well organized and is dispersed over a large area, fishing tackle shops provide an important opportunity for, like an important bottleneck to engage with anglers, and it serves as kind of a meeting point. And we know from the community-based social marketing approach that in-person interaction is really, really important in order to make norms visible. The fourth is to use some work that I did in my PhD, to focus on using influential members of the recreational angling community to promote these otherwise unenforceable catch release behaviours and to incentivize and provide social value to what it is you should be doing. A lot of South African angling guides are very well respected, and we have the opportunity to make real differences in how catch and release is done on angling trips, but also to exploit their reach on social media. A lot of these angling guides are viewed by a very, very large portion of the South African community, and if we can get them to do the right thing, we may be able to spread that message even further. And then the last step here is to use technology. So we know that angler apps and fishing apps have real potential to be a good source of data, and considering our fishery is basically unmonitored, we've partnered with this up-and-coming app in South Africa, which we think has enough intrinsic value to encourage anglers to actually diarize through it. And we really think that that will not only give us the opportunity to monitor an otherwise unmonitored fishery, but also to initiate social nudges and the kind of information we want pretty close to where it is we need it to happen. And then the last step is to obviously roll this all into a strategy and pilot it, and then ideally, Sasha, if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, to follow the keep fish wet model to develop a social brand that has enough intrinsic value to try and overcome this perceived illegitimacy of management agencies to actually convey the information that is we want to share and try and put this all together into a neat package. So that's what we have planned. I'm really open to any criticism or any thoughts. Thanks very much for hearing me out. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. I'd like to invite Adam, Craig, Andy, Russ and Matthew to join us up the front. Don't run away, Matthew, come back. Unfortunately, we've only got 10 minutes, but 10 minutes is far better than nothing. For you to ask any questions that you might have. There's also water down beside the chairs there if you want them. Just in quick summary, what we had was that Adam talked about the importance of actually identifying your audience, exactly who you're talking to in any particular issue. Craig worked through a really fascinating process of actually looking at the collaboration between all the players involved in the process of updating our use of technology, particularly the use of farmers and how they work there. Andy went through looking, and I'm really summarising, so please feel free to expand. I know I'm just picking one little tiny bit out of every presentation. Using fishes as the drivers of research questions. Quite often as scientists we tend to rush in with what we think is the problem, and to engage them was to actually get them thinking about what their problems are and us helping them solve them to get them to be stewards. Russ, the challenges in managing, and I know that you were talking at length with Patrick Hone about this yesterday, of nationally engaging fishers in policy development and how we go about that in the different forums to actually get them involved and maintain their thoughts on the credibility of the process. And lastly, Matthew, I think it was a really nice summary of sometimes how we actually have to step away from the formal processes and look to social media to reset social norms. So as that is a quick summary of the huge expanse that we've covered, I'd like to invite anybody with questions. Yes, up the back there. We have got a roving mic, or you can use your voice very loudly, whichever you
I'll
like.
yell really loud. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, Russ, this question's for you.
No questions from the U.S.
He might swear, you better be careful.
But so in your list of top bullets from the Recreational Fisheries Summit,
Yeah.
habitat wasn't on there.
So habitat is a key part of our entire focus. And in terms of there was one of the slides that's, one of the boxes that talked about conservation and restoration. And so the habitat was included within that. My program, I think we've done about, in the last 4 years, 17 different projects, which one of the guys here is going to talk about tomorrow. Tim Sartwell is going to talk a little bit about tomorrow. But then, as we heard this morning in one of the keynote speeches, we've got about $1 billion to invest in habitat over the next 4 years in 3 different pots of money. So it is a critical part, and even within our national policy, one of the first goal is essentially supporting and enhancing the resources on which recreational fisheries depend, including habitat. So that's in our current policy, and that'll stay.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, just down the front here.
Russ, more just a clarification. The slide you put up with the socio-economic indicators,
Yeah.
was that just under your jurisdiction, or was that the whole?
That's the
United
whole.
States?
So I cover the whole, from the state of Maine to Guam to Alaska to.
Yeah.
the
So
Caribbean.
inland as well, though?
No, that is
No,
just the
it was-
marine
yeah,
environment.
yeah,
Just
yeah,
the
yeah,
marine,
yeah.
just marine.
Thank you.
We got, yes, Colin.
Yeah, my question's for Matt.
Yes.
I noticed on one of your slides, Matt, you got a lot of marine protected areas and
Yes.
coastline of South Africa, but you made no mention of that as being a possible management strategy. Can you comment on that? Does it fit into your plan?
It does, and so SANBI, which is the organisation through which we're driving this in a big way, plays a very big role in deciding how those protected areas are laid out and to support the decision making. But the word on the street is that the government's not really interested in putting any more no-use areas down. They're more interested in alternative effective conservation, other effective conservation measures, which can be spatial, but the classic MPA, as we know, is a no-take in South Africa, is not really a tool that's on the cards for the foreseeable future. It has played a role in some improvements for one of the species. We think, based on a little bit of data that we have for it, but that MPA was only promulgated 3-4 years ago. So it does, and a part of the research gaps that we're going to address in another part of the strategy is to identify critical spawning habitats. And then I think we may, whether it's through a traditional MPA or some other sneaky way to restrict the use of that area with one of these other spatial measures, I'm not sure, but those would definitely be prioritized. But my gut is they may not play the biggest role.
Thank you.
If that answers your question.
We've got 2 more, 2 quick questions. So we'll go to the front and then mid left-hand side.
Russ, just interested about the feedback loop. So there was some points on your slides there about confidence in data, confidence in the management agencies. You were talking about the leaders that you have in your network there. One of the gaps that I experience in the fisheries management jurisdiction that I'm a recreational angler within is a lack of feedback. So we get that opportunity to have that input, whatever forum it might be, formal forums, informal forums, but we don't get that great input, feedback back about the foundations of this decision making, particularly when they appear to be quite contradictory to a majority of the advice or the majority group advice. How are you guys handling that?
We suffer from the same affliction.
Yeah.
It is often referred to as the black box. They provide us input and whatnot, and they say we never hear anything back. There are so many different mechanisms. We try to, essentially, my program tries to encourage each of those mechanisms to sort of improve their steps in doing so. We try to do better. but it's a constant struggle, and we really have not found a truly effective feedback, sort of a silver bullet at this point.
Is it, just very quickly, is it a capacity issue, or is it is?
In part, it's capacity.
But is there also some concerns about, blowback that might come back when the?
The blowback is nonstop. Andy asked to be at the beginning, who gets blamed when the fisheries experience declines? Sure. I get blamed.
Sure. Yeah.
We get feedback, it's just not always in the way we would like.
Just understanding the driver. Thank you.
And it was you. Yes, that's
Quick
right.
question for whoever cares to answer it. So I work in the UK where anglers have a fairly limited amount of say over either management action or even rights of resource. Do you think there's a role for us scientists, I guess, or those who are here, to sort of be more advocates for the recreational fishing industry? Because is that a way to build trust and increase engagement and all that sort of thing?
100%. I think so.
Okay.
I think we're beyond the point where I think as scientists that also fish and we understand the motivations, and I think that we should feel okay about stepping outside. We can be objective about our science and our process, but we also understand the motivations behind angling, and we can make those connections to the industry, we can make those connections to anglers. I think that's where we can make more positive inroads to build that trust, to have that greater capacity to create more science-savvy anglers that understand that how slow policy change can happen, or how quickly grassroots changes can happen, and understanding everything that connects things in between. So I would say yes.
Great.
But I'm biased.
I think we all are. Thank you.
We've got about a minute or so. There was, yep, Renee, just a very quick one.
This is for Aaron.
Aaron?
Andy.
Andy.
Sorry, Michael.
No, that's okay.
Thank you, and somebody else is doing.
I want to understand, when you're engaging with those anglers, are they coming to you, are you going to them, or is it above that at a higher level with those NGOs and bodies? Like what's the tools you're using there?
Yep, I would say all those cases,
Yep.
the anglers came to me.
Right.
And part of it is because of my connection with angling agencies, the industry, angler-based NGOs.
Yep.
And it's just through word of mouth. And I think that the fact that they come to me first, and then I work with them, and this is where I do have to be I've learned to be incredibly patient. I can't tell you how many opportunities or how many emails I get from angling clubs, and they're like, we want to tag fish. I'm like, all right. Why?
Yeah.
Let's work through the process of testing hypotheses. What are your motivations? How are you going to do tag reporting? And that takes up a lot of energy, a lot of time, but I feel that it's worthwhile doing that, because in that process, then I help build capacity, not only in terms of like how the science is done, but also build capacity in the trust in the scientific process and that feedback. So all of those cases, that's where I find now, and I'm not sure if I'm unique in that case, but I have more angling clubs and anglers and NGOs approaching me to do research than I have ideas of my own. And what's neat is that I'm finding that more and more angling organizations and anglers are becoming a bit more savvy about the questions that they're coming to me with. So it's a neat model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good question to end on, so thank you very much for that. And I think that's a really good point that covers all the speakers, is that ability to listen and engage and then provide feedback to close the loop. As a social scientist, that's the biggest thing that we always find is the challenge, is closing the loop and getting back to people who've been involved, so that they can build the trust that was prevalent through all the speakers' presentations this morning. So please join me in thanking, oh my God, this is just shocking. And go and have some lunch.
you.